Standing next to Takuma, Kusakabe complimented the placement of Yuta's barrier. While Yuji and Yuta were fighting tooth and nail to put Sukuna down, everyone else was expected to surround the barrier. That way, there wouldn't be any blind spots for Sukuna to take advantage of. They planned for Maki to rush in once Yuta properly broke a part of the barrier. That was to be the signal they would all keep an eye out for. Takuma lifted his mask to argue his point. He believed that more of them should try to enter Yuta's domain. After all, they originally planned for this to include Choso. Kusakabe made it clear that now wasn't the time for a change of plans. If they decided to take that approach, Sukuna's focus would shift to outside the domain. Maki's sneak attack being anticipated would be a horrible outcome for them. There also weren't many of them who could properly engage in a fight involving special grade sorcerers. To himself, Takuma was pretty sure Kusakabe would be just fine. But he leapt away and Maki took his place as Kusakabe called out to her. It was her turn to battle the King of Curses. Maki took a breath. Then she placed her hands on the ground. She assumed a running stance once they were both gone. Her eyes remained trained on the barrier as she anticipated Yuta's signal. Kusakabe knew that the signal would appear when their target's defenses were at their lowest. Finally, Kusakabe could see the signal they'd all been waiting for while standing on another building. This was their best and worst case scenario. Yuta received the Gojo treatment from Sukuna's last attack, and now Rika is crying with a hand raised in his direction. Maki managed to land her hit on the ancient curse, but he still had a smile on his face. While she kept him in place, Rika rushed off with Yuta in her arms. Kusakabe called out to Wiwi for assistance. The young sorcerer leapt down with the sheet, prepared to teleport Yuta elsewhere. Meanwhile, Maki moved to raise her blade and carve through Sukuna vertically, but he rushed off the end before she could do so. Now with a bit of distance between them, Sukuna was able to accurately process what just happened. Yuta's domain wasn't destroyed. He ended it on purpose. He now realized that this was a sign for the others on the outside. They wanted to give him a false sense of victory that they could capitalize on. Once his eyes moved to the crack in the barrier, Maki and her heavenly restriction would move to destroy him. He concluded that not having cursed energy was enough to let a person pass through an ordinary barrier with no trouble, and the cursed tool was placed inside the domain in advance. That's when Sukuna noticed that something was off about the wound she just gave him. It was healing far slower than any of his other injuries. As it turns out, if the split soul katana is used by someone who is able to perceive the soul, any wounds they cause cannot usually be healed by reverse curse technique. To do so, a target would need to possess an awareness of their own soul's outline. Thanks to sharing a body containing two souls, Sukuna is actually aware of his own soul's outline. The same is the case for Yuji. But thanks to the after effects of his fight against Gojo, Sukuna isn't able to totally treat his wound with reverse curse technique. Elsewhere, despite Megumi's unwillingness to resist Sukuna and continue living, Yuji refused to give up on his friend. But just then, he felt a terrible jolt of pain and fatigue. Suddenly dropping to his knees, Yuji began spewing blood. With wide eyes, he wondered what the heck was going on. But it didn't take long for him to figure it out. Despite learning reverse curse technique, he's received a total of 4 attacks from Sukuna that would have been fatal otherwise. Something in his body hasn't totally healed just yet. He wondered where it was in a panic. He desperately needed to figure it out so that he could return to the fight. To interrupt his thoughts, a familiar hand was placed on his back. He was told to take a breather. Choso told his brother to remember what he learned. He needed to visualize it. He needed to let the blood within him spread throughout his entire body like roots. He'd be able to do this by visualizing an outline of his body made with his veins. Elsewhere, Maki leapt down towards the road Sukuna was happily running down. The King of Curses launched an attack in her direction. The streetlight she was closest to had its top cut off, while Maki used the body as a launch point. She ricocheted and rolled at Sukuna's feet, and wasting no time at all, Maki slashed in his direction. Sukuna jumped up to dodge, and with the same swinging motion, Maki rose to her feet. With her target stuck in a linear motion, she lunged forward for yet another piercing assault. But this time, Sukuna caught the blade in his hand. He gleefully shifted his trajectory to the left and away from his body, leaving Maki vulnerable. Or so he thought. Maki was smiling now too. With overwhelming strength, she completely toppled Sukuna's hulking frame with just a single arm. Now having a bit of fun, she decided to take things even further by launching him onto the side of a higher road. Once he made it there, Sukuna joyfully cleaved it into countless tic-tac-toe boards. Even as the chunks moved in her direction, Maki remained unfazed. Sukuna sent what was effectively an avalanche of debris in Maki's direction, although this was not enough to deter her as she could handle it just fine. But what she failed to notice were the sounds of his incantations over the barrage. All she managed to hear was the last one, twin meteors. Sukuna launched this mantle, cutting through the entire assault. But Maki managed to get out of harm's way just in time. Sukuna couldn't stop smiling. He noticed that Maki could see his technique far better than the other sorcerers. This was reminiscent of his fight against Mahoraga in Shibuya. High praise indeed. Maki was reading her opponent too. She could tell that he was using cursed energy to keep his heart beating while he healed himself. This reminded her of Megami's account of what Sukuna did at the juvenile detention center. Returning a smile, Maki asked if the old curse plans on keeping up that little heart trick while they fight. Something that Sukuna didn't see much of a problem with, considering he is not being pushed that much here. At the same time, a shirtless Hakari was in the midst of an icy battlefield against Uraume. It wasn't like Sukuna was being hidden from him or anything, but he couldn't help but point out how easy the guy's presence was to read. Uraume, who seems to have taken a few hits by now, wanted Hakari to be more direct with his comments. After a chilled breath, Hakari admitted that the sight of Sukuna's true form alone was enough to let him know how much trouble they were in for. But even still, they were actually getting the job done. He could tell that Sukuna's cursed energy was only getting lower and lower. Despite the large chunk of ice that now covered his right shoulder, Hakari lifted his left hand and declared that once everything is said and done, they will be the winners. Uraume mocked him by pretty much saying that a promising approach is enough to make a fool naive and unsuspecting. Hakari didn't seem to get it on account of how Uraume worded it, so he figured it was some kind of compliment. Although he was pretty sure that Yuta was the more auspicious one. Uraume clarified that none of them could possibly account for Sukuna's ever-shifting behavior. Frankly, the King of Curses wasn't all that interested in them, so his curse energy would match his enthusiasm. They simply didn't have anyone else that could compare to the challenge presented by Gojo. Uraume was certain that despite the ramifications of his fight against the Limitless User, Sukuna still hasn't gone all out just yet. Even now, we have yet to see his true power. The Sukuna haters are absolutely losing their minds. The King of Convenience conveniently has another power-up to be revealed. Oh man, I cannot wait to see how explosive the conversations will be when Yuji somehow manages to beat him at his strongest. Eventually. We're still pretty far off from that, I'm sure, but please leave us all your thoughts and predictions in the comments. As always, I'm Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.